Democracy 101. If you have not taken Democracy 101, we'll give you an exam now so that you can be prepared for the class. Who said, "As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master"? This expresses my idea of democracy. Raise your hand. Yes. Lincoln, correct. Who said, "No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all lies"? Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. Winston Churchill, very good.
John's here for counsel.
Who said, "He who would save liberty must save democracy"? Norman Thomas. Who said, "Two cheers for democracy"? One, because it admits diversity, and two, because it permits criticism. E.M. Foster. Who said, "Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary"? Man's capacity for justice makes democracy possible, but man's inclination to injustice makes democracy necessary. Reinhold Niebuhr.
Where?
And finally, who said, "I seek the password primeval"? I speak the password primeval. I give the sign of democracy. By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. Anybody? By God, I will accept nothing which all cannot have their counterpart of on the same terms. Walt Whitman. Okay, you passed. Today, the word liberal suffers the same negative fate in religion as in society and politics. Yet it is important to recall that liberal religion is not limited to any one age. It springs from a way of thinking and feeling which is at least as old as the Greeks and the more humane Hebrew prophets, and as new as the more recent developments in democratic theory. The meaning of liberal is non-dogmatic. The dictionary defines it as giving freely, generous, not sparing, open-minded, not prejudiced, not literal of interpretation, for general broadening of the mind, regarding many traditional beliefs as dispensable, invalidated by modern thought, liable to change. Liberalism in religion refers to freedom of thought, tolerance, and humanitarian values of modern Western culture. Theological liberals have always asserted the claims of reason against the petrified orthodoxy, and have sought freedom for diversity of belief. In the modern period, they have declared the need of theology to incorporate the basic values, aspirations, and attitudes which are associated with modern democratic culture. Liberal religionists teach that God may be found in the worlds of nature and history. God operates through natural laws, and the divine presence permeates all life. The Bible is a record of the advancing religious awareness of the Jewish people, a historically conditional norm of religious experience to be interpreted and reproduced in light of the progress of culture. Most importantly, the theological centerpiece of liberalism is not dogma or doctrine. It is rather ethics and morality, which are regarded as the essence of religion. Life in this world, rather than life after death, is emphasized. Human life is viewed as more positive than sinful, and history is interpreted as moving forward to the establishment of a world of freedom, justice, and peace. Malchut Shamayim, the kingdom of God on earth. In his book, Intellectual Foundation of Faith, Professor Henry Nelson Weiman writes, "Thus the faith of liberal religion reaches beyond all available answers to the actuality operating in human life, about which we need to know more than we now know. Such a faith is in a sense an absolute faith, because it does not depend on any fallible belief or answer. It is absolute because it is founded not on an answer, but on a question of such sort that when any answer is found inadequate, another or better answer is sought. In this way, liberal religion can never be disillusioned, can never fail. It can always spring anew from every defeat. As in science, every error discovered only opens the way for further inquiry. Finally, liberal religion is the only way we have of meeting the challenges that modern science, philosophy, psychology, biblical research, and comparative religion pose to our traditional faiths today. It is our only bulwark against dogmatism, fanaticism, literalism, and intolerance in religion." Gut gesagt, no? I was introduced to the writings of Protestant theologian Henry Nelson Weiman, who died in 1975, as a rabbinical student at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the late 1950s by Mordecai Kaplan, who died in 1983, the Jewish theologian and founder of the Reconstructionist movement in American Judaism. Kaplan utilized Weiman's 1958 book, Man's Ultimate Commitment, in his course in philosophy of religion, assuring his students that they would always find in it something to preach during their service in the ministry. I read Weiman's book avidly, discovering something to underline on virtually every page, and I did indeed frequently find something preachable in it in the course of my rabbinical career. Now, it is not often that a work by a Christian theologian serves as a text or is so highly recommended to future rabbis by their professors. I cannot say that I was not a bit surprised or a bit anxious, as I found myself agreeing with, delighting in, and inspired by what I found in Man's Ultimate Commitment. I gradually obtained copies of Weiman's earlier books and became even more impressed. When his Intellectual Foundation of Faith appeared in 1961, I devoured it. And to use a biblical phrase, cut a covenant with Weiman forever. In many respects, Intellectual Foundation was more of a Christian book than Man's Ultimate Commitment, and I might have been turned off by it. But by then I had become so assured of the essential correctness of Weiman's positions on God as creative interchange, and liberal religion as a series of questions rather than prearranged answers, that I was able to substitute the Jewish people for Jesus Christ, the synagogue for the church, and the Torah for the Holy Spirit in Weiman's writings, and feel quite at home with his ideological formulations. It seemed quite clear to me then that Weiman had extended biblical monotheism the additional inch or two necessary for its becoming relevant in the modern world. By that time, I had also become convinced of the uncanny similarity, almost bordering on identity, of Weiman's position with that of my mentor, Mordecai Kaplan, whom I consider to be the outstanding Jewish thinker of the 20th century. L'chaim. Weiman and Kaplan were among the most acclaimed representatives of American liberal religion and luminaries of their respective religious communities from the 1920s and 30s to the mid-40s, when their versions of religious naturalism and religious humanism were eclipsed by the neo-Orthodox Protestantism of Reinhold Niebuhr, in Weiman's case, and the neo-Hasidic Judaism of Abraham Heschel's in Kaplan's. In my opinion, these developments are more correctly attributable to a failure of nerve among religionists because of the Second World War than to weaknesses in the thought of Kaplan and Weiman. In addition to their role as apologists of Judaism and Christianity, the Torah as a source of spiritual value was one of Kaplan's major concerns, and Christology one of Weiman's. These two theologians charted new pathways in religious naturalism and empirical theology, and pointed to new horizons for pluralistic process thought. Before, during, and after the war, they spoke out on the problems of American society and strengthened the devotion of many of the co-religionists to the promise of democracy. They developed startling insights into the meanings of community and peoplehood, often expressing their philosophical and theological views in language reminiscent of the verse of poets Walt Whitman and Carl Sandburg. They also seriously considered how to include democratic values and concepts and foster commitment to democracy in American education. They charted new pathways in religious naturalism, which means religious thought rooted in the natural world rather than in supernatural revelation. Empirical theology, which is talk of God grounded in human experience. And process thought, an orientation towards themes of change, relationship, and creativity in human experience. In order to assess Kaplan and Weiman's contributions to American religious thought, it is worthwhile to examine the context of what was happening in American Judaism, Protestantism, and Catholicism, and in American philosophy and theology during the first half of the 20th century. At this time, Protestantism, and to some extent even Catholicism, were preoccupied with the social gospel movement and the rise of liberal theology, two developments that brought Christianity into conversation with the secular world and the social sciences. Kaplan and Weiman were particularly influenced by such American philosophers whose names we heard just a few minutes ago: Josiah Royce, William James, John Dewey. The religious liberals of the early 20th century continued the work of the Enlightenment and led religion into the worlds of modern science, philosophy, and history, as they sought to free religion from obscurantism and narrowness. They stressed human freedom and creativity, and the ability of human beings to do good to others. For these liberal theologians, the establishment of God's kingdom on earth would be the natural worldly outcome of the historical process. As historian Sidney Alstrom has written, their confidence in the future outran even that of the Enlightenment's apostles of progress. American religious liberalism, in particular, was characterized by ethical passion and a preoccupation with lived religious experience, rather than with tradition or imagination. According to Daniel Day Williams, the 5 principal aspects of the incorporation of experience into American theology were: 1, treatment of religious experience as a source of knowledge of God. You find out what God means from your personal, individual experience of him or her. 2, emphasis on experience as the testing ground for moral character and for the achievement of moral goals. 3, the use of religious experience as the sign of vitality in religious faith. 4, the viewing of experience as the field for cooperation among peoples of differing doctrinal persuasions, and as modernist use of present experience for criticism and interpretation of traditional doctrines and practices. Another commentator writes that American religious liberalism emphasized the immanence rather than the transcendence of God, the centrality of experience rather than the appeal to external authority, and evolution in nature and dynamism in history rather than a static cosmology and worldview. While clearly within the broad stream of American religious liberalism, Kaplan and Weiman were critical of certain liberal presuppositions. They were radical modernists, of course. They took the scientific method, empirical fact, and prevailing forms of philosophy as their points of departure. They believed that their traditions had to be evaluated in the light of modern science, modern philosophy, psychology, and sociology. Nothing was to be adhered to unless its relevance could be made apparent. For them, God was imminent in cultural evolution, and society was progressively moving toward realization of the kingdom of God, even if such a goal might not be attained in the near future. This is why Bill Maher, who I enjoy very much, is full of baloney when he talks about religion. He doesn't know anything about liberal religion. Kaplan and Weiman were also clearly influenced by the social gospel movement of American Protestantism. Social gospel's fundamental claim was that the way to a profound personal experience of God in the modern world follows the highway of social religion, and that religious self-realization manifests itself as a religious enthusiasm for humanity. The social gospel movement emphasized both the enrichment of individual personality and the development of democracy. It sought to relate ideas of the Bible and religion to the need for social and economic reform, or social action in American society, and sparked similar tendencies in American Catholicism and Reform Judaism. Peoplehood and community. Concerning community, which is the way to God, or is God, because God is another word for the common good. You know that our Orthodox brothers and sisters won't write the word G-O-D. They write G-D. They take out the O. We put in an extra O. We leave the original O and put in an extra O. When we say God, we mean good. Concerning community, Weiman wrote, being caught into and participant in the community of meanings, which is the life of the group, is for people the fullest happiness, or perhaps we should say, the highest blessedness. The anonymous member of the community will be much happier than those who are known, honored, and sung. What lives after him will be not his name and not his fame, but the stream of life in that community will be more full and deep because of him. And Kaplan wrote about peoplehood, that it is the social structure of society from the most primitive to the most advanced, including government, economy, culture, and religion, which provides through those organizations and institutions the necessary conditions for salvation, or the self-fulfillment of the individual. Why are we hung up on this word salvation? Yes, the Christians use it a lot. They're right about it. The fact that they use the word salvation a lot is no reason for us not to use it. It is used in Judaism all the time. You can't say Havdalah without saying Hinei El Yeshuati. God is my salvation, my help. Eftach v'lo efchat ki ozi v'zimrat ya Adonai v'hili li Yeshua u'shafte mayim b'mayne ya Yeshua v'Adonai ha-Yeshua alamcha birchatech hasela Adonai tzvaot imanu miskav v'Adonai Yaakov tzvaot Hoshea. We always say Hoshea now. That's salvation. So let's stop worrying about the fact that the Christians use it a lot. They took it from us. We can take it back. Kaplan goes on to say that insofar as the self-fulfillment of the human person is inconsistent with total annihilation at death, it calls for some form of immortality. That demand is satisfied through the organically constituted people with a common history and common destiny that is the sum of all the individual lives which have been and will be identified with it. A people, community, tribe, clan, group, family. A people thus provides its individual lives a kind of continuing radiation or anonymous immortality. We live in the continuity of the Jewish people. And as Jane Howard, the author of a book entitled Families, writes, call it whatever you want, a clan, a nation, a tribe, a group, whatever you call it, you need one. Salvation, says Kaplan, is self-fulfillment. The self-fulfillment which enables you to perpetuate your life, even though people are going to forget your name, and whether you prefer French fries or fried onions. But you will live in the community, in the people, in the nation, in the tribes. For Weiman, the God of salvation, and by the way, Kaplan and Weiman both agreed that that is the key word of religion. Because God is whatever affords us salvation, helps us live, and make something of our lives, give meaning to our lives. Yeshua, Yeshua, Yeshua. Hoshiana, Hatzlichana. That's all about salvation. For Weiman, the God of salvation is to be sought in growth, community, creativity, and creative communication among individuals and peoples. God is the infinitely rich, complex, and yet unified growth of community among people. God cannot be thought of as an ideal or possibility of value that does not yet exist, nor as a being existing in some other world outside nature. God is rather the concrete growth of community, or the continued growth of individual personality, nation, culture, or historical or planetary epoch. God is creativity, operating to transform destructive conflicts into creative conflicts, and to bring diversities into that kind of interaction which transforms them into mutually sustaining parts of a more comprehensive system while retaining their diversity. The word God may become a device with which to conceal from oneself and from others the true character of one's faith. For Weiman, the word God refers to a kind of communication, the kind which creates appreciative understanding of the individuality of persons and peoples when they allow it to operate in their lives, creating society, sustaining all these in their being, and increasing the values in them when required conditions are present. This operative presence creates in each individual his capacity to love and appreciate and understand the individuality of others. Creative communication, not manipulative communication, not selfish communication, but creative communication, where you take within inside yourself the best that the person you're communicating with has to offer, and he or she takes the same from you, and both of you grow from that kind of communication. That is God, or as I said earlier, the common good. All goodness stems from that. Such communication occurs between persons at all times to some degree. But to be radically transforming, it must rise to a high level and overcome the counter processes which ordinarily obstruct and oppress it. When it rises to a level of power and dominance, it endows life with all of its great values. God is the process of creative good or creativity, which in the form of creative interchange and internal integration operates to transform human life in a way that it could not do by itself. It delivers human life from evil, because evil is communicating only with the desire to get the other person to agree with you, and his or her desire to get you to agree with him or her. not to grow from the experience. It is the greatest good which human life can ever attain. God can never be a person or personality. It is a logical fallacy to call God a person. Now, what does Kaplan say about salvation? He calls it, and if you forget everything else I say today, remember this: salvation is durable happiness. Salvation is durable happiness. God is the power or process that makes for durable happiness. The central element in religion is not its idea of God, but its idea of what is durable happiness, what is salvation. Since whatever constitutes salvation for the religious community determines the idea of God which the religion of that community professes. God is the correlate of the idea of a better and happier world, or of the salvation of humanity. God is the power or process of interdependence and creativity that enables society to fulfill itself. God is the creative, coordinating, integrative process of the universe, insofar as it makes for the salvation of people, both individual and social. Nature's God, or Godhood. It's not a person. It's nature's God. We like to call it Mother Nature, but it's not a mother. We like to call Eloheinu our Father, Avinu Shebashamayim, but He's not a father. It's nature's God or Godhood. Stop saying God. Say Godhood. Or say, as I do, good. Nature's God or Godhood is identical with the totality of creative processes in man and nature which make for self-transcendence and self-perfection. God is that aspect of the whole of nature, both in the universe and in people, which impels us to create a better and happier world, and every individual to make the most of his or her own life. Whatever goads you, impels you, inspires you to make this a better world and make yourself a better person, that's God. And the achievement of that, to whatever degree, is salvation. You can't get more than that. That is immortality. That is a meaningful life. That is self-realization. That is what you want to get from yoga, which you can get without yoga if you remember what I'm telling you today. God is the functioning in nature of the eternally creative process, which by bringing order out of chaos and good out of evil, anything that helps bring order out of chaos and good out of evil is salvation, is self-fulfillment. Kaplan sought to divorce the God idea from mythology, anthropomorphism, and supernaturalism, and identified with all human conduct that strives for the creative survival of the human spirit, of the human species in a warless world. Since we can now understand the moral aspect of social existence that impels us to fulfill ourselves as human beings, we can freely reject the supernatural elements of traditional religion. We can find God in the urge to truth, honesty, empathy, loyalty, justice, freedom, and goodwill. Religion must be purged of an attitude of credulity. It must be purged of intellectual fixation on some past stage in the history of one's religion, and of other things. Although Kaplan emphasized moral responsibility and conscience as the principal manifestations of Godhood in human life, he sought to prove that ethical traits are the subjective expressions of objective processes in nature. To Kaplan, the idea of God is a correlation of the idea of salvation or self-fulfillment. God is the power that makes for salvation, and salvation is the functioning of God. It reflects the awareness of the organicity of the universe, and awareness that there is enough in the world to meet people's needs, but not enough to satiate their lusts and greeds. And by the way, at this point I should say something about mysticism, which everybody's been talking about. Mysticism is an indispensable aspect of religion. But when it becomes the main part of religion, it's dangerous. Because mysticism means simply emotion. And when you start worshiping what feels good, what seems good, what gives you a good feeling, instead of what makes sense, it's dangerous. And although Kaplan had some nice things to say about mysticism in the course of his career, he wound up afraid of it. Because progress in religion comes only through reason, only through rationality. So we can be mystical sometimes, but then we have to use our brains, not our feelings. Oy vey. For Kaplan, the idea underlying democracy is that the interests uniting human beings, if they become truly aware of those interests, are strong enough to ward off the divisive influence of people's differences. The crucial problem of freedom is how to guard our individuality and the capacity to think for ourselves, and yet cooperate with those whose backgrounds, upbringings, and outlooks are different from our own. This is an art, said Kaplan, that human beings are slow to learn. Democracy should be conceived as a process of social experimentation by which people are willing to learn that art and to apply step by step the wisdom acquired as a result of such experiments. This is what the art of free voluntary cooperation, the ultimate objective of democracy, must. That is why the art of free voluntary cooperation, the ultimate objective of democracy, must constantly be cultivated. Fundamental is the understanding that no matter how human beings may differ, they are all desirous of being free. To doubt this, said Kaplan, is to lose faith in humanity. And since faith in God is essentially faith in God's power to make for salvation or redeem humanity, to lose faith in the potentialities of human nature is to lose faith in God as well. The cynicism that surrenders to brute force as inevitably supreme is the ultimate atheism. The cynicism that surrenders to brute force as inevitably supreme is the ultimate atheism. Kaplan insisted that democracy is a quality of nationhood. Under the influence, national solidarity functions as a means of fostering the maximum welfare and collaboration of all who compose the nation, regardless of race, color, or creed. Such welfare and collaboration presupposes unity in diversity and freedom from oppression and exploitation. Democracy's purpose is to have justice and kindness instead of tyranny and cruelty pervade in all human relationships. To bring under control the inherent tendency of human beings to seek power and to exercise it for its own sake, regardless of the harm it does. Democracy seeks to salvage the freedom of the mind, to recover the right of every human being to exercise the most divine power which he or she possesses, the power of reason. Kaplan believed that faith in democracy and its possibilities for human living had to be strengthened and deepened by the church, the synagogue, and the religious school. And that kind of democracy has to be taught to all American children. and especially in the public school. For Weiman, democracy, despite its goal of the development of the individual to the maximum degree possible, must primarily be concerned with society. Democratic government is always a matter of degree, but a government is democratic to the measure that all its citizens exercise effective influence in making the important decisions which are announced and executed by the government. In order to make these decisions, citizens need to be aware of their own needs and of the needs of others. For this reason, political democracy is possible only if society is so ordered that people can express themselves to one another freely and fully and truly, and find appreciative response from others when they do so. Creative interchange is democracy. Democracy is creative interchange. Creative interchange is God. Hood. And Godhood is creative interchange. It is not necessary to talk about God as a person. It's dangerous to talk about God as a person. What talk about God as a person has achieved, it has achieved for civilization. Now we're at the point where it is harming civilization. We have to start talking about Godhood, or G-O-O-D. This is necessary because people cannot discover their own needs and the needs of others, nor their common needs, nor the needs which can be served by decisions of government unless this kind of interchange occurs. Not only is this kind of society required in order to have political democracy, it is the first responsibility of political government to sustain, protect, and build up this kind of social order in all walks of life, so far as government is able to do this. Democracy, says Weiman, is superior to all other social systems in that it fosters conflicting interests. Although conflict is often dangerous and may be destructive, it can also be the chief source of life's enrichment when it compels and is submissive to an intensive interpretation of the conflicting interests of all participants to one another. If in the past the chief concern of American democracy was to release the individual, in the future its major occupation will be the interpretation to one another of the conflicting interests of diverse individuals and parties. Democracy is successful to the minimum degree in dealing with conflicting interests when this mutual interpretation issues in something modifying of its antagonistic operations, whereby they are coordinated and the conflict brought to an end. It is successful to a higher degree when the interests are transformed, although not integrated, to the mutual interpretation, so that each operates to produce a more richly qualitative and amply meaningful order of events. It is successful to a still higher degree when the mutual achieves integration of the conflicting interests, issuing an even more richness and amplitude of meaning than the separate maintenance of those interests could achieve. Thus, for Weiman, democracy's source is creative interaction, or interchange, and its goal is the growth of a rich variety of many qualities relative to a wide range of diverse happenings, or qualitative meaning. The upholding and further development of an order wherein events can be distinguished and connected so as to render their quality and meaning appreciable to all concerned is the goal of democracy. The upbuilding and further development of an order wherein events can be distinguished and connected so as to render their quality and meaning appreciable to all concerned is the goal of democracy. According to Weiman, democracy is in decline because the democratic peoples define democracy in terms of private, local, competing, and transitory interests, rather than in terms of that development throughout history which creates freedom in social relations and in the mind of people. The power of the democracies has been weakened in dealing with problems requiring high intelligence combined with sacrifice of private interests to serve a public good continuous throughout history. All of this is in the newspapers every day. This is what we're reading about every day. But there is a common good underlying the aggregate of private interests and sustaining free society. It is the creativity releasing and developing all the constructive potentialities of the individual and releasing him from the unconscious and conscious fears and hates, distorting and suppressing his creative potentiality. You've been a very good class. It's my duty at this point to tell you that we're coming to the end, so stick it out. Weiman states that the fulfillment of 3 requirements are necessary in order to save democracy and freedom. They are truth, faith, and education. People must be made to recognize the common good, commit themselves to it religiously, and educate themselves throughout their lives in the problems of social existence and in the religious commitment necessary to retain a free society. Education must bring individuals to that level of maturity where they will see and appreciate and be committed to that supreme good of human life to be gained through conflict when held subject to mutual interpretation of conflicting interests. Education itself implies a commitment of one's whole self to creative interchange, and such commitment is essential to the very nature and purpose of education. Education lacking commitment to the creative interchange by which the whole self learns is the kind of education producing people who are unable to sustain with passion and power the society which educates them. Education must establish as central to its entire understanding this commitment of faith. This commitment is a rudimentary kind of religion. On the relationship of democracy to religion, Weiman and Kaplan are in complete agreement that in Weiman's formulation, a religion can save us which sees and declares that all things in heaven and earth and all the works of men are judged to be good, bad, or indifferent according as they either help the people to conserve their community against the dangers that threaten it, or else help them to improve it with more of beauty, more of truth, and more of moral goodness. Despite minor differences of emphasis and individual nuances which may be attributed to personal predilections on the one hand and to different emphases in their respective historic religions on the other, Weiman and Kaplan are in essential agreement in their espousal of an unabashed religious naturalism, emphasizing human society as a stage of human salvation, without neglecting the role of individuals, and democracy as humanity's best hope for realizing its destiny through openness and reciprocity, creative interchange, and moral responsibility, mutual learning in depth, and the establishment of justice and equality in personal relations and society. It is clear that these two theologians have much to contribute to current discussions of the interface between religion and culture, religion and politics and democracy. Thank you for listening. Now you can ask me anything, because if I don't know the answer, I'll make something up.
What was your relationship to Kaplan?
I loved him. I'll tell you why I loved him. First time I saw him, he was saying Kaddish for his first wife. I went to the Shiva house. It's the first time I ever saw him. He davened the evening prayer, Ma'ariv, and afterwards he read one of his own personal prayers. And some of my fellow students from the seminary were surprised and were laughing. What's he reading that for? We finished about it. And one of Kaplan's daughters said, "Don't you laugh when my father is reciting a prayer that comes from his very heart." And one of the last times I saw Kaplan before he entered the Hebrew home of Riverdale, New York, was when I found him sitting alone by himself in a dark room in the SAJ, crying. I went over to him and said, Rabbi Kaplan, why are you crying? Why are you sitting alone? And he threw up his hands and said, the Jewish people, our Jewish people, what is happening to our Jewish people? I could never forget those things.
So thank you for your talk. I don't mind the word salvation at all. I love that that's what it's about, as I've learned from you here and as I've been learning from Mel, especially the last few years. The whole point is the full realization of the human being within the context of community, developing in an intellectual, ethical, spiritual, social, psychological, etc. way.
Abrochaft ein Kaplan.
Thank you. And if that's what it's all about, so that's what it's all about. I'm excited to know that's what it's all about. But I don't think that we understand, our institutions, our congregations, our movement understands that that's what it's all about. And I don't think we're organized to deliver on that. And I don't understand why, if that's what it's all about.
You're right. There'll be another session when we can discuss this in detail. But I am in complete agreement with you. We've had wonderful creative interchange.
Can you say why, if these two men thought very similarly, why is it important for us to maintain our Jewish heritage? Like, why don't we follow what Weiman is saying? Why should we stay in our community as opposed to another
Why should
community?
we join Felix Adler that Professor Skoll was talking about a little while ago?
Yeah. Why can?
Kaplan writes, a man without a tradition is worse off than a person without a country. Remember that in the 19th century, the great book was The Man Without a Country. The man without a tradition, says Kaplan, is worse off, far worse off than a man without a country, because a man without a country lacks a foothold in the present. A man without a tradition lacks a foothold in the past, the present, and the future.
Manny, can I answer that question in Kaplan's words?
Jack, you can do anything you want. I love you. Go ahead.
At a conference in 1969, when the students were asking the same question, Kaplan answered. He said, being for human rights in general, being for ethics in general, being for goodness in general is like talking in general without any language in particular. The language of the Jewish people is our history and our culture and our being as a community. And we have to talk all of these things within the terms of that experience. And that was
Jack, you're very, very right. And actually, the basis of all the things that we're talking about is language. Language is what made us a people. When the Jews left Egypt, the difference between the Jews and the Egyptians was the language. They spoke a language which was strange to us, and we spoke a language which was strange to them. Whether that or not that is historically correct, that's what the Psalm says. The Psalm was written later. The point being, the main difference between groups is language. That is the fundamental difference. And out of language, culture grows. And culture is associated with language. Therefore, Kaplan put such a stress on the fact that every Jew must know the Hebrew language. I put it differently. I say that every Jew must be studying Hebrew throughout his life. Throughout his lifetime, a Jew must study Hebrew. By the way, I think that's true of Yiddish as well. But that's another discussion. That's another discussion. Kaplan spoke very often about the need for us to learn Hebrew, to know Hebrew, and about Yiddish as well. If you read Dynamic Judaism, you will find that.
Didn't he was interested in Esperanto?
Esperanto is euch a Yiddische Sache. Esperanto was a universalistic language created by a Jew, Ludwig Zamenhof, and it's a wonderful idea. But first we've got to get our own language in order. We've got to know our own languages. And that's very, very important. Language is the basis of the whole thing. Everything that I've said today and everything that Mel has said so well is to be found in Mel's books and in Dynamic Judaism and in the American Judaism of Mordecai Kaplan, and now in Mel's the American Radical Judaism of Mordecai Kaplan. Have a wonderful day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.